Good evening, everybody. I'm Philippe Sands, zooming in from France, and I am so delighted to have a second Hey appearance with wonderful Leïla Slimani, who is zooming in from Rabat in Morocco. And we are talking about her extraordinary new book, The Country of Others, which is the Hey Festival Book of the Month for August. And you can find copies on the Hey Festival website or buy a copy from your local bookseller, hopefully an independent local bookseller. Questions are welcome throughout. Please just send them in on the chat. They'll be passed on to me on the questions tab. And I promise you I'll do everything that I can to put as many of your questions to Leïla as we can possibly get through in the hour that we have. And I finish also by thanking everyone who's donated to the festival's future fund when registering for this event. You continue to support the festival by zooming in and also by donating on the website. Leïla, welcome. It's fantastic to have you back.
Thank you very much.
Vous êtes très bienvenue. Your new book, and I'm afraid I've only got the page-proof copy, The Country of Others, is a different work from your others. I've read, I think, everything that you have published in book form, Lullaby, Adele, and of course, an extraordinary non-fiction book about sex and lies, true stories of women, your travels around Morocco. Last time we spoke at the festival, I think in 2019, that had not yet come out. And that is a very remarkable book for me, as someone who has a keen appreciation of Morocco. I've been several times. This book takes you into a different direction. Rather than have me try to summarize what you're doing, why did you write this book and what is it really about?
Why did I write this book? That's always very difficult to answer this question. The other day I said to a journalist that very often I lie when people ask me, why did you choose this theme for your novel? Because the truth is, I don't really know. It's always a mystery why you decide to write that book and not another. But I've always known I was going to write one day a novel about my grandparents, about characters inspired by my grandparents, because as a child and then as a teenager, I was completely fascinated by them. And I thought that I had such a wonderful and very original material with the life of my grandparents that I had to write about it. But when I told my publisher a few years ago, he said, I think it's not a good idea that you write this right experience. You need to wait a certain time before writing about your family. And so, because I always obey my publisher, I said, okay, I'm not going to write about it right now. But after Lullaby and all the success of Lullaby, I spent a lot of time touring everywhere in the world and a lot of time alone in hotel rooms. And when I was looking for what can I write, the only thing that came to me were those scenes my grandmother used to tell me about, little anecdotes in the family. So I wrote the little scenes and I sent them to my publisher. And he said, okay, now I understand what you want to do, and I think you should write about that. And I think that was also a moment where a lot of people were asking me about my identity, because when you go and you meet a lot of journalists around the world, as a woman from Morocco, as a Muslim, a lot of people were very interested in my identity. Who are you? What are you? What do you believe in? And it was always very difficult for me to answer this question because I had the feeling that my identity was very complex and I was very frustrated by the fact that they could put me in little boxes, the French woman or the Muslim woman. And I've always wanted to say, I'm not only this. And I thought that maybe the better way to answer the question about my identity and for myself also to understand where I come from was to write a book and to go back to the couple of my grandparents and try also to understand what was this very particular time that is colonization that had a huge influence on my family and of course on myself.
So for me, it is a book that interweaves, in a sense, two separate but very intimately connected stories. One is a very personal story of family, a relationship between a man and a woman who are drawn in some ways, inspired in some ways by your grandparents. But the other story, of course, is the end of old-style colonialism in Morocco. And I want to touch on both. You've already mentioned, actually, a word that for me, this book is centrally about identity and a grandchild's relationship with their grandparents, which is not so well studied, but we all know that the grandparent has a different relationship to the little child than the parent does. Maybe could you begin by saying a little bit about your grandparents and how they met and who they were, and also your relationship with them as a young child?
Yeah, when I was a child, I spent a lot of time, all my holidays, in the farm of my grandparents near Meknes. At that time, in the 80s and 90s, the farm was quite far from the city, so they were isolated, and there were really farmers living from that farm, and the kind of people who really, the old school farmers, not so much technique, not so much modernity. They didn't have the electricity. And as a child, I loved to go there because it was wild. It was very different from the life in the city. And they were living near a little village of Berber people. So my grandmother, she used to speak Berber. It was very different from the life in Rabat. And also, I was fascinated by my grandmother because she was very tall. She was blonde with green eyes. And she used, as I said, to speak Arabic and Berber with a very strong Alsatian accent. And it was very funny. And I remember that when she was speaking Arabic, people would smile, would laugh, because at the same time, she knew to speak as a Moroccan, but with this accent. And my grandmother was a storyteller, a great, great storyteller. And with my sister, we would always ask her, please tell us a story about when you were young, when you met our grandfather, about the war, about the years of colonialism. And she had the sense of the anecdote. She knew how to create suspense, and we would spend hours listening to her. I don't really know if she told me only truth or if she lied to me and she built fiction. I suppose that a lot of those anecdotes are not completely true, but I was fascinated by the power she had when she was telling a story. And one day I told my teacher at school, I said, my grandmother, she's a great, great storyteller. And I was telling her every day. So one day she said, okay, I'm fed up with your grandmother. Tell her to come to the class and she will tell stories to all the children. And so my grandmother accepted, and she came to my school, and she told to all the people in my school the stories about the war, and everyone was fascinated. And I was so proud of her. And she was very clever because at the end of the story, she brought a big bag of candies and she gave to every children. So I was very, very proud of her. But she had that. And my grandfather, it was different. He was I don't know how to say in English, il était taiseux. He was very austere. He was a man who didn't speak a lot. And I think he was very traumatized by the war, by colonialism. And as sometimes I even felt that he didn't like the fact that my grandmother was telling us so much stories. He was probably the kind of man of that generation who thought that it's better not to share too much about that time. Because for him, colonialism was also a period where he felt very humiliated, where he was victim of racism. And people think in the Western countries that colonialism is taboo in France, in England. Of course, it's true, but it's also taboo in our countries. And people tend to forget that. But in a country like Morocco and many countries in Africa, people don't like to speak about that because it's also speaking about a time where people were humiliated, were victim of racism, were dominated, and they don't really want to remember that this period of time.
I mean, you won't know, but colonialism is something I spend a lot of my time working on. And I don't know whether you were in another capacity responsible in some way, but President Macron 3 years ago said something that surprised a lot of people. And I used it in court, in the international court, and the French judge was very upset with me. Macron said colonialism was a crime against humanity. And no Western president had ever said that before. Did you have a role in that?
I hope so. I hope so. And this is a conversation I had with him at many occasions. And I know that he's absolutely convinced of that because he belongs also to my generation. We have the same age. So he belonged to the first generation who has a certain distance with colonialism and who feel completely confident to say that it was, of course, a crime. There is nothing else to say than it was a crime against humanity. It was a crime against civilization. It was a crime. It was a betrayal also of every values that France claimed, like freedom, equality, and fraternity. But he said that when he was in Algeria, and it's even more important because in a country like Algeria, saying that and hearing that in the mouth of a French president, it's huge. Yeah. There is a big difference between Algeria and Morocco and Tunisia. When you go in Algeria, people still have a lot of anger against France. For the majority of them, I won't say that they hate France, but they have a lot of anger, a lot of bitterness against France. In Morocco, it's very different. People who say that they love France, France is our friend, there is no problem. And so when I began the book, I was like, how is it possible that we were colonized by this country? And at the same time, we feel that, okay, everything is okay. They just left. We shake hands. Thank you very much. Bye-bye. You go back to your country. We stay here. And then when I made my research, I discovered that it was very violent, actually. And it's funny to see how the two countries decided not to speak too much about this violence and to do everything to forget that and to act as if everything was smooth and fine. And France left with no violence, and of course it's not true, even if it's not the war like in Algeria, but it was very violent.
But you describe, so the novel has two central characters, Mathilde, inspired perhaps by your grandmother, and Amine, and of course you haven't yet mentioned, because those who are watching haven't read the book. It's literally just come out in England. I know that we've got viewers from Poland and Montreal, and maybe you have seen the book. But of course, they were born into very different worlds, the two of them. Can you say something about that? Say something about how it was for your grandparents to have one with an Alsatian background, a grandfather who fought for the French in the Second World War. The other book that I've spent a lot of time with this summer is the extraordinary novel by David Diop about the Sénégalais and the Senegalese who fought for the French in the First World War. You have a character who fought for the French, as your grandfather did, in the Second World War. Say more about this duality of backgrounds.
When I was a child, in the living room of my grandparents, there was a big painting of my grandfather as a spy. The spy, it was a regiment of the colonial army. My grandfather was an officer, so he was on a certain level in the colonial army. And so he wear the traditional uniform. It's a sarouel, and you have also a burnous, so big thing on your head. And my grandfather was very proud, I think, to fight for the French and for the colonial army. His father himself was a translator in the colonial army. So in the family of my grandfather, they had always collaborate with the French. They had no hostility against the French. There was this, they belonged to a very traditional family. They were poor, and for them, working with the French was the possibility also to not only to have money, but to go to school, to be educated, and to be connected to more progress in every levels. I mean, in terms of health, in terms of education, and everything. So when the war began, my grandfather decided immediately to go to France and to fight. So he went, and he was arrested in the north of France, and he spent 2 years in a camp in Germany, and he escaped from this camp, and it was terrible. I think that the experience of being a prisoner in Germany was absolutely terrible. But he didn't spend a lot of things about that. He just told me about the escape, and he was helped then by a German farmer, and then by a French woman who helped him, took him to Paris, and then he came back to Morocco. But my grandfather was very, very proud of that. And when he came back to Morocco, I think that he had mixed feelings, because at the same time he was a hero. He had this uniform. He was an officer, so he had a certain position in the Moroccan society and in the city of Meknes. And at the same time, at the moment he comes back, it's also the rise of the nationalist movement, and it's more and more difficult for him to claim or to be proud that to participate to the war and to have been so close to the French. So I think that for him it was always mixed. And my grandmother, she was a little bourgeois in Alsace. She came from a little family of le sud du Rhin. My great grandfather, he was a farmer and a businessman. He loved to drink, and he loved to party and to play cards. He was quite a very funny character, I think. And when I think about it, my grandmother, she was very open-minded, because in 1944, to meet a Moroccan man, a soldier, you know nothing about him, about his religion, his culture. And she decides, yes, I'm going to marry him and I'm going to go with him to Morocco. And her family was open-minded too, because my great-grandfather, he never told her, no, I forbid you to go, or I don't want you to marry an African man. They were not racist at all. And I think it's quite extraordinary when you think about it. Even today, some French woman who wants to marry an Arab, they can have very bad reaction from the family. But my grandmother, she went with she was very adventurous, and she wanted to discover something else than her little village in Alsace.
Not just in France, where sort of intermarriages are found.
Yeah.
Although I have to say, London is one of the better places for that. I married, my partner is a New Yorker, and we're constantly comparing London and New York, and London is streets ahead. Now, so this in the novel, but also in life, this couple enter a maelstrom. They come back to Meknes, or near Meknes, and they enter a conflict zone, because the end of colonialism is in sight. The United Nations has dictated that this is over, it's finished, countries are going to have their independence. And this is articulated in the novel through Amine's brother, or at least it was for me, Omar. Say a little more about that, because what I'm fascinated about in the novel and in life is the way in which great, big political developments translate into the minutiae of family life. That, for me, is where the rubber hits the road, and that is where it gets interesting. And so you have two brothers who have a sort of a different approach to what's going on. Tell us more about that. Who is Omar?
Omar is the younger brother of Amine, and when Amine leaves for France during the war, Omar stays in Morocco. And when France will be defeated by the Nazi in 1940, you have to imagine that in Morocco it was terrible, and it changed completely the vision the Moroccan had of France. For the first time, they thought this country is weak. This country is not the superpower country we used to think. And this country is collaborating with the Nazi. And they was telling us about freedom, about equality, about fraternity, about les Lumières. And now this country is collaborating. And when France decided to collaborate about the Jews and to deport the Jews out of France, the king of Morocco, Mohammed V, he said, you will never touch a Moroccan Jew. And if you try to do that, I will myself wear the étoile jaune. So for the Moroccan people, really, it was a deception, a disillusion about France when France was defeated. And also at that time, Morocco was occupied also by the regime de Vichy, and they decided to use all the wheat, toutes les récoltes was given to the front in France. So it was a great famine in 1941, 1942. People in Morocco, Moroccan people, were starving, really starving. And when you read about it, it's terrible. People had nothing to wear. You would find women with little babies who died because no milk, no bread, nothing. And I think that all that of course nourished the anger and the hatred against France. And Omar, he belongs to this generation. He's 13 in 1942, and of course he hates this country. And he's happy because he says, at that time you would see people saying, "Thank you, Hitler, for defeating France," because they had the feeling that this country for the first time it was showing her true face. And so Omar, he decides at the time to go with the nationalists, but he's a very violent boy. He's very uncontrollable, very difficult to control. And so at the beginning, the nationalists don't want to do nothing with this kind of boy who wants violence all the time. And he hates his brother. He hates him and he admires him at the same time. It's mixed feeling. This Amine, who is a hero, who is always he's so loved by his mother, and he's the perfect man, and his mother always admires him. So I think that Omar, when he wants to fight against France, he wants to fight against his brother. He wants to show him, I can be a hero too. You think you're a hero, but you're just a traitor. I'm going to be the real hero in this family, and I'm going to go back to our tradition, our culture that was taken from us by France. And of course, when his brother comes back with a French woman, for him, it's the confirmation that Amine is a traitor, that Amine understands nothing to what it is to be a real Moroccan, a good Moroccan. And he's also la préfiguration. He shows also what is going to happen in the Moroccan society even today, this idea of what it is to be a good Moroccan. And this idea also of radicalism. That's why I'm very interested in a character like Omar. He wants no nuance, no complexity. He believes that everything is white or black. Yeah. There is no gray. He doesn't believe in confusion. And Amine and Mathilde, of course, because of their situation, they know that everything is complex, that everything is gray, that everything is ambiguous. And I think that the main conflict between those two is that the idea that of radicality against ambiguity.
Well, life is often easier in black and white.
Yeah.
I think we all know that. So that's one big political tension in a family life. But of course, we then come to the other, I would say, equally big. It's a political tension, but it's also a tension of family and other things, the relationship between the man and the woman, the relationship between Mathilde and Amine. And this is complex. And this brings us back to themes that we do in relation to your other writings, your novels and your nonfiction resonate. The place of the woman in the home, the woman's relationship to the man. You and I have talked about this. Tell those who are watching a little more about how you teased out that relationship, because it's more complex when the characters are not entirely artificial. Sure, they're characters in a fictional novel, but you lived with an aspect of this. Explain to us how this all came together.
As you said before, there's a zone of conflict, but in this book, I wanted to draw sort of parallel between the conflict in the country, the political conflict because of independence, all that, and the conflict inside the house, inside the group of the Belhaj family. When Mathilde arrives in Morocco, one of the first things that makes her very uncomfortable is the position of women, and especially the woman in her own family, the family of Amine. And when she arrives, immediately also she can see that her husband is very different. He doesn't want to take her hand in the street. He doesn't want to kiss her. He's always afraid that people are going to look at them, to judge them. And what he loved in Europe, he doesn't love it anymore in Morocco. The fact that Mathilde, she speaks loudly, that she wants to go to the cinema, that she wants to go everywhere with him. And he says to her, here, it's not like this. Here, it's different. And you have to adapt to that. A woman, she can't do this. She can't do that. She can't behave like this or like that, or she's not a good woman. She's a bad woman. And I think that's the thing at the beginning that really surprised Mathilde, but in a bad way, and especially through the character of Mouilala, the mother of Amine, who is really the traditional Moroccan woman that still exists at that time, the kind of woman who would spend a lifetime in the house, never go out. She would go out 1 or 2 times a year to go to the mosque at the end of Ramadan or something like that, or to visit the family. A woman who always obey, who never ask question, who think it's normal to cook all day for the family and never to sit with people to eat, because she would eat in the kitchen. And what was interesting is that Mathilde, at the same time, she judged her at the beginning, and she said to Amine, how is it possible to accept such a life? And I'm always interested in that. When you see someone who is dominated, at the same time, you want to say, you want him to emancipate, you don't understand why he's not free. But it's also very cruel and I think very unfair to judge someone like that and to say your life is nothing, your life is bad because you're dominated. I wanted to show also that Mathilde is going to learn some things from Mouilala. Mouilala is dominated, but she's not stupid, and her life is not nothing. Her life is valuable because she did things, a lot of things for her children. And there is also the character of Selma. And Selma, she is really this new generation of Moroccan women. In the 40s, the King of Morocco decided to make a big speech in front of the television with his daughter called Aisha. And the princess, for the first time in the history of Morocco, she take off her veil and she made the speech with her hair. And for the first time, Moroccan women will go to school. You will see Moroccan women who will learn to drive cars, but also planes. There was for 10 years, 15 years, really this idea that Moroccan women will accept to modernity, to education, to emancipation. Of course, in the 50s, 60s, we will see that it would not be as easy as the nationalists thought. But this is really a changing moment in the life of Moroccan women.
And it's a theme that comes up. I mean, in the book, there are many lines. There's a moment where Mathilde worries that she's going to be a shadow, a nameless, ageless being. That's the English translation. It's not your original French, that she will be just a woman, a wife, a being at the mercy of others. That, in a sense, is one of the beating hearts of the book, is it not?
Yes, absolutely, because it's also the destiny of many women of that generation. You would go from the house of your father to the house of your husband. And the idea that you could have a life of your own without asking anyone about what you would do was something that a lot of women wouldn't even consider. For them, it was impossible. You had to be married to have a position. And those women, they ask their whole life for money, for the right to go there or there, to this or that. And I wanted to, I really wanted to add those characters in my novel and try also to explore the life of those women, the life in the house. For many years, maybe for centuries, I think that novelists were not interested in domesticity, and they would think that if there is a topic that is not interesting, it's domesticity. We don't spend time describing what happens in a kitchen, in a bedroom. But I think that what's very interesting in the literature today is that we understand that what's happening behind closed door is not only important, but political, and has social repercussion outside the house. And even today, there is still a sort of omerta. You have the right to denounce what's happening in the public space, but you shouldn't denounce your father or your brother or your husband. And the secrecy that that still exists when it comes to the household, I think is very interesting. Yeah. And yeah, I really wanted to explore the life of those women who spent hours and hours cooking, hours and hours coudre des vêtements for their children, sewing for their children, and also the violence. I think the origin of violence and the origin of domination begins in the house. Domination towards children, towards women, towards domestic. And I think it's very important to explore that, because we can't fight for feminism, for equality, and for all that if we don't fight at the core of the problem. That is the structure of the family. And the pater familias, it still exists. And of course, at that time, it was very important. The father would come in the house and everyone was like soldiers, with an officer. Yes, sir. No, sir. And I think people were frightened by the figure of the father. And of course, in a country like Morocco, you have God, the king, and the father. This is really a patriarchal society where you have always to look up at a male figure.
Well, Morocco is not alone. We're
no.
familiar with other countries. I mean, it was an interesting experience for me, because the book arrived in the post. The publisher sent it to me. I read it over one weekend. I didn't read any of the reviews in France. I didn't read any of your interviews in France that had come out. So I didn't know that it was drawn when I read it from a family history. And for me, there was an additional tension, because in terms of the sympathy of the reader as you're being taken along this journey, and it does seem to me there is a great love of Amine, the grandfather figure, but the relationship with Mathilde is of a different order. And the anxiety that you have, and at some point, frankly, the hope is that the relationship is going to come to an end. But it doesn't, because there is also extraordinary intimacy and love, as well as abuse. And it is precisely these points of detail which you describe so gently, but also so brutally, that I think are at the heart of this novel. It's life. It will be familiar to everyone who reads it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's life. And 2 or 3 days ago, a reader asked me a question in a conference, and he said, I don't understand why Mathilde would accept such crap. And he was judging her. And I think it's not, of course, as a novelist, I can't do that. And I think as a reader, we shouldn't do that either, because there's no point in judging that. Of course, she accepts things that can seem to us unacceptable, but it's the case of many, many women in the world, and many people in the world. In a couple, you accept things, and years after you can say, oh, why did I accept that? I should have left. But it's easy to say, not very easy to do. And for a woman like Mathilde, she has no diploma, no formation. She's very far away from her home. Her father died. What is she going to do? You have also to imagine that at that time, for a woman to have a divorce, and to, especially in a country like Morocco, she would have lost the custody of her child. It's a disaster. It's a tragedy. But today it seems very easy, and we can judge her. But at that time it was different. And I wanted also to show that their relation is very complex. As you said, yes, he's very brutal, and he's sometimes very cold and very unfair. But there is also an intimacy, and there is something also very sensual between them, where after this big fight, she refuses to speak with him. And the only way she communicates with him is through sex. And they have a very intense and strange also sex life. So that's something I imagined. But I knew a couple who was always fighting. And I know that at the same time, they had this crazy connection, sexual connection. And I wanted to describe that. The fact that sometimes you can't communicate with the world, but there is a real intimacy when it comes to your body.
Yeah, and you've described that in your other novels. And I think it's of central importance. We all know that. We are all aware of the physicality of a relationship in a different way, and the importance of a sexual intimacy which can somehow transcend other things. I think women are much better about talking about it than men. I talk about it with my women friends. I have much more trouble talking about it with my men friends.
I'm not surprised.
I want to ask you another question, because it's something that's I've confronted. I mean, I don't write novels, I write nonfiction, but my book, which in French was Retour à Lemberg, East-West Street in English, is about my grandparents. And I wonder, for you as a novelist, what responsibility you felt when you were touching on material that was drawn from people you were close to, you loved. What did you feel was your responsibility as a novelist in treating or using such material?
Of course, I ask myself this question all the time, and especially now that I'm writing the second part of the trilogy that is about the generation of my parents. So a lot of people are still alive. Yeah. In the case of my grandparents, they were dead when I began the book. So it helped me also to create a certain distance and not to be afraid of their reaction. But I think that the moment when I was writing and I felt that Mathilde was not my grandmother anymore, but she really was a character of a novel, but she could be a character of a movie. I could see her. And when I saw her, she was not my grandmother. She didn't have the same face, the same way of speaking. She was very different. And I think that that's the magic of fiction. You use a material that is very close to you, and through certain details and through the magic also of language, the character is not your grandmother anymore. And when I gave the book to my mother and I said to her, if there is something that really you don't like, something that you don't want me to share, you tell me and I will change it. And she read the book and she said, no, it's fiction. It's a novel. It's not me anymore. She said I was reading about things that I lived, but I didn't even remember that it was my experience. So yeah, I think that you have to trust language, and you have to trust the magic that comes from language and from working on fiction.
I wonder if it's easier or more difficult doing it as a novelist or as non-fiction. I mean, I really struggled.
I think it's more difficult as non-fiction in terms of responsibility. I mean,
I had discovered that my grandfather had in Vienna in 1938 a homosexual love. And my mother didn't know about it. My mother's alive.
Wow.
And it was a real struggle. And this, as you were writing, as I was reading you, once I reread knowing that it was drawn from real people, I asked myself, if Mathilde, Anne, your real grandmother, were to read this book, how would she react? Because of course she wrote her own book, which I've just ordered actually, because I was so fascinated by her. How would she react, do you think? If you were to
badly, I think she would not be happy at all. But you know, she was very very severe when it comes to my books. I remember that when I published Adele, Dans le Jardin de l'Ogre in French, she said to me with her Alsatian accent, "It's pornography." And I was like, "No, it's literature." "No, it's pornography." For her, it was porn. So for her, I was a porn writer. So yeah, she was very hard on me about what I was writing. No, I think that she wouldn't have loved it. She would have been a little bit angry against me. But
she loved you very much.
Yeah. She loved me. She loved me very much. But yeah, I think that she would probably have been angry.
Look, so I mean, I could go on for hours, but I won't, because the questions are pouring in. So here are some questions. And the first question I want to put to you, we were touching on it a little before. We're having this conversation at a truly horrendous moment. Kabul, Afghanistan. And there is a question that has come in from Justin. Do recent or current events in Afghanistan resonate with you and a book set in post-war Morocco in terms of tensions and clashes of culture? I'd also add the gender issue, obviously, women.
Yeah, it resonates with me just because I'm a human being, I think, and because I'm a citizen, because I'm lucky enough to live in a democracy, and I know what privilege I have living in a democracy where I can have my rights as a woman, as a citizen. I'm not only sad, but I'm very angry, and I'm scandalized by what's happening what a waste, what a shame for the Western country, what a shame for Europe, for America, when you think that they stayed there for 20 years for that. People now just want to, because we will have no surprise with the Taliban. Now they say that they are going to change nothing in terms of women's rights, but there will be no surprise, and people are going to the airport and trying to flee because they know that there is no surprise with those kinds of men. They want to destroy everything that is freedom, beauty, love, music, enjoying life, and they are going to destroy this society again. So many women were killed those past years, journalists, dancers, artists, and now for sure the majority of Afghan women will have to renounce to their job, to their education, and it's going to be a disaster. And I'm very, very sad also, and I hope it will remind us, all feminists in the world. I spend a lot of time with feminists in England, in France, in the US, and today we are very much obsessed with a lot of things and we fight about, but we forget all the time about other women. And sometimes I want to tell them, you should stop also wasting so much time for nothing, and we forget about women in Afghanistan, in Congo, in Syria, in all those countries. We spend time about debating about cancel culture, but do you know what is cancel culture? Taliban can tell you about cancel culture. Taliban, they destroyed the statue of Buddha, they destroyed the old books, they destroyed lives, they destroy all the individual destiny. That's the cancel culture. So we have to fight against this cancel culture instead of wasting our time.
A little earlier in the conversation, you said that in Morocco in the 1950s, in the 40s, once people had seen that France had collapsed against the Germans, had collaborated, they saw that they were weak and they could be defeated. Is this a similar moment? The US, Britain, Afghanistan, to a lesser extent France, but Britain and the Americans in it up to the hilt. And they've been basically knocked back. I mean, we're coming up to the 20th anniversary of the events of September the 11th. It's unbelievable. The Taliban are back. And they have defeated two pretty powerful countries. What are the consequences? What signal does that send?
I think that what it shows also is the defeat of the idea that France had, but Britain also, and then the US, the idea that they were going to bring democracy to the Arab countries. They were going to build new countries of modernity, and maybe the idea that you can't do it from abroad, that it has to come from the society itself, that people have to believe in democracy, that you have to educate people to give them, the conviction that they want to live in this kind of society. But the problem in Iraq, in Afghanistan, they did, in Libya also, they fought, but they did nothing for the people. They did nothing in terms of education, in terms of emancipation of women, and that's a terrible failure.
Moving back to your this book, you touched on it, but again, a lot of people who are watching won't be aware that Country of Others is part of a trilogy. It's the first, and you did mention you're just about, and I think somewhere else I read, you're just about to write the final scene of the second one. Ivana asks the question, and of course you'll answer it how you want to answer it. Do you know how this trilogy will end?
Yeah, roughly, I know how it ends, but the third part is going to be about my generation, so a little bit about me. So I don't know how I'm going to end. So it depends on what's going to happen to me in the next year. But yeah, I have an idea of what's going to happen in the third one. I've just finished the second one, as you just mentioned, and the third one will be a little bit different. I think it will be a mix of fiction and non-fiction, and there will be the character of the writer. And I will talk also about what it is to write a trilogy. So there will be a book in the book. So it will be quite different.
That's fascinating. We've got time for one final question, a more literary question from Ruth Keane. How do you, Leïla, develop character and the dynamics of interpersonal relationships in words? How do you use words to develop character?
Um, Characters are the beginning for me. When I begin a book, I really need to know things about the main character or one or two characters. And I don't have a plan. The way I write, my process is not very structured, but I have visions, I have scenes, I see my character. I write a little bit like a filmmaker, because I see my characters doing things and I just describe them. So I work a lot with pictures, with movies. I need to have really a very precise vision of them. And for the character of Aisha, for instance, the daughter of Mathilde and Amine, I could see her very, very well with her hair and her little face, her wild face. And the first scene I wrote was the scene of the compass, when she puts the compass in the neck of the little girl in the class. And then I wrote the scene of Mathilde going to the bar with Amine. So I don't write in the order like in movies. And then I don't really know how, but then there's a logic that begins to happen through. I think it comes from language. It comes from, as I was saying before, the magic of language. And then there's a structure, and my characters, they speak to me. They tell me what they want or what they don't want. I have a friend, writer friend, Dar Benjeloun. He's a Moroccan writer also. And one day he was completely blocked. He was writing a book, and his character were in Marrakesh, and he didn't know what to do with them. And he told me that he had a dream, and he could see his character telling him, "We need to go out of this city, do something for us." And that's true. Sometimes our character, they speak to us. So yeah, there is a part in writing, and I think it's important to say that is very mysterious. It's very difficult to, people ask you all the time about your process, about how you do, but very frankly, I don't know how I do it. And that's what I love in writing. There is something like a trance, something ecstatic. Sometimes at the end of the day, you read what you just wrote and you're like, I wrote that. And you don't really know where it comes from, but that's what's wonderful with writing.
Well, it's magical, and you've written another magical, very, very important book that will touch many people around the world in different ways.
Thank you
Leïla
so
Slimani,
much.
Country of Others, we're really grateful. Thank you for giving Hay Festival your time again. We hope to see you again in person soon. And grand merci. Have a wonderful end of summer in these difficult times. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.